Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me. I want to give you some details about this podcast before we jump into it. For this episode, I spoke with Steph Bradshaw. She lives in Missouri. And Steph Bradshaw has an extensive history with horses and positive reinforcement. We spoke about everything she did and learned in her childhood with horses, and then her formal education, where she decided to go up to Canada to get an animal behavior degree. She's then continued education with additional certifications, including barefoot trimming and a few other things. Her personal learning journey has included some painful lessons that she learned from a dangerous rescue horse who actually put her in the hospital at one point. We discuss what it means to use a trauma-informed approach to horsemanship, how to use constructive recommendations when advising clients. Steph has an excellent education and a really great presentation style. She's obviously reviewed this information a lot, and this lady knows what she's talking about. So if you're interested in positive reinforcement, if you want to hear details of how she came around to being an advocate of positive reinforcement after having used more traditional approaches and pressure release approaches, she is a great person to listen to and to get her perspective. So this will be part one, and hopefully next week I will have part two. Thanks for listening. Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of Putting the Horse First. I'm your host. My name is Isabeau Salas, and my guest today is Steph Bradshaw. And I had a few questions for Steph today. One, my general question about what does it mean to her to put the horse first? And then my second question is going to be, since she's a positive reinforcement specialist, I have an interest in positive reinforcement. I've taken some lessons, been doing reading up, listening to podcasts, practicing on my own horse, and in my work as a barn manager. So I've got a couple of people lined up to talk to, and I'd like to discuss, some practical things that barn managers can do for positive reinforcement. Start out, if you want to tell me a little bit about your background with horses.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. I'm Steph. I am a lifelong equestrian. Started when I was about 2 years old, I think was the first time I met a horse. The way my parents describe it is from that point on, I wouldn't shut up about horses. And I think anybody who knows me nowadays knows that that has not changed. In my background, I existed within the traditional equine industry as opposed to the positive reinforcement industry. And I did a lot of, I think the most I did was in dressage. I did classical dressage, and then I also did some competitive. I coached my university's dressage team, and then as a youth competitor, I did a variety of disciplines, somewhat similar to what you had mentioned with your background. I started out saddle seat. So I remember having the farrier pull the giant pads off of my horse's feet right before we went into the show ring to make them like show legal or doing something with their feet. I was 6 years old or something. And that's also when I learned that being a youth national sounded like this big, like youth national champion sounded like this huge title. And then I went to the competition and realized there were like 200 of us, and we were all going to go home with some variation of that title.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Started out there. And then at some point, one of the lesson instructors that was hired at my barn sent a mass email to a bunch of the parents saying, this is cruel. This is inhumane. This barn is bad. They don't treat their horses well. This is everything wrong with it. And you should leave.
Oh, goodness. Wow.
Yeah. And my mom went, oh my God, we've got to go somewhere else. And so she switched me over to a hunter jumper barn. And I did that for a little while. And then eventually someone was, this is so bad. Hunter jumpers is so bad. This is all the reasons it's bad. And my mom went, oh my God, we've got to do something else. And so then I think I went to like some competitive trail stuff, did some like different Western disciplines, some reining. And eventually I found myself with a classical dressage coach. And that was the closest that I was able to get to a truly horse-free, for the horse's benefit type mentality. I eventually dabbled quite a bit in the natural horsemanship philosophies. I found that a lot of the narratives there sort of tied in with some of the narratives in my personal life and upbringing as far as dominance and coercion goes, which is unfortunate. But because there were those parallels, things seemed to make sense. And I had this thought that that was just how the world worked. And then eventually I kind of got out of horses. I had a moment where I was at one of the big dressage competitions, and I brought my horse off the trailer, and I was so embarrassed because I couldn't afford a big fancy warm blood. So I had a big old, needs a lot of maintenance, hanging on by a thread to be able to compete at this level of warm blood. And he was miserable. Like, he looked miserable, he acted miserable. And I remember just this like overwhelming self-consciousness of, oh my God, like I'm so embarrassed to feel awful for like making this horse do this. And I should be so embarrassed. And then I looked around and I realized that I could not see a happy horse anywhere. I looked all around. I walked around the facility and I could not find a happy looking horse anywhere at this competition. Every single horse seemed stressed or uncomfortable in some way, shape, or form. And so at that point, I was, maybe competition is just the problem. And so I stopped competing. Again, natural horsemanship type stuff. So I was like minimal pressure. But then the more I did that, the more I realized the less pressure, the less motivation. And so eventually it got to the point where I was like, I don't really want to apply pressure, but I can't make anything happen without pressure. So I'm just not going to do anything. So at that point, I had 2 horses and I retired them both, and they were just backyard pets. And then I went to Canada. I went to university up there and studied behavioral neuroscience.
Nice. Good for you.
Yeah,
Good choice.
thank you.
Well done. Good job.
Yeah. So my goal there was to work with orca whales. I do have an orca, but she is a Cocker Spaniel Basset Hound mix. And although she loves water, she is primarily a land-based creature.
Gotcha.
And although my goal was to work with orca whales, once I got up there, I ended up joining my university's equestrian club. And that evolved into doing like the coaching for their competitive dressage team and getting really involved with horsemanship again. And this time I was able to apply a lot of other knowledge. So during my studies, I had not only learned a lot about neuroscience and learning theory, but I also had the opportunity to work with a variety of other species. I was also, while I was doing my bachelor's, I started getting my education to become a veterinary technologist, and I started working as a vet tech. So I worked at a small animal clinic, and then I also worked at a large bird sanctuary and particularly fell in love with the cockatoos. And then I did a lot of internships at zoos and aquariums as part of my studies. And so I got to work with this wide variety of species. And suddenly, all of the things that I was taught about horses started to fall apart. And it was kind of interesting because
very interesting. Cool.
And it was interesting because I was working with horses again. And so I was picking up these old mindsets and these old techniques, but I had all of this new knowledge and information, and I had grown a lot as a person. And so while I was doing that, I started to realize, I was told horses are too big, they're too dangerous, you can't treat them like a dog. And I'm like, okay, but also the hippos and the marine mammals and the elephants, every other large, dangerous animal, even the tigers and the big cats that would literally like to eat us as a snack if they could. And with them, one of the reasons we do positive reinforcement and we stay away from punishment and restraint-based techniques that we use with horses is because they are dangerous. And punishment-based techniques and restraint-based methods are incredibly dangerous when working with an animal that is larger than you or has the potential to overpower you. That started to fall apart. And then it was, horses, they're not wild animals. They're not zoo animals. They're domesticated. Okay, well, we clicker train dogs and we clicker train all of our domesticated animals. Well, but horses are prey creatures. Okay, but we're also clicker training these birds, even small birds. And I'm clicker training lab rats and mice and other small rodents and bunnies that are definitely more prey creatures even than horses. So that's not the case. And then it's like, okay, well, they're too smart. Well, no, because we can clicker train like primates and marine porpoises and cetaceans and these really intelligent animals and parrots. And so they're not too smart. And then it's like, well, maybe they're not smart enough. Well, but we also, like one of my projects, we used a bridge signal and we used positive reinforcement to train fruit flies to fly to colored targets on cue. And so after that, I realized no animal is too dumb to learn with positive reinforcement. So from there, all of these constructs and these rationalizations started to fall apart. And then finally, I still had other things pulling me towards the traditional industry. I was in Vancouver, which is a super expensive place to live and a really expensive place to keep horses. And the university team was helping me afford the board at the equestrian facility I was at and I was managing, and I had to maintain a certain performance level. And so there were these pulls to keep with the traditional methods that I was used to and successful with. But then at the same time, there was this pull to always be trying to do the best thing possible and the most ethical thing possible. And even then, being traditional, I was regarded as like the super soft trainer. If a trainer in the equestrian community where I was got annoyed with a client for being too like soft or not willing to be harsh enough, they would send them to me to go hang out with the tree hugger, happy softie. And that was even back in the traditional days, right? So a lot of classical dressage focus on biomechanics and riding being an athletic exercise and something that should be benefiting the horse physically, as well as like a very minimally aversive negative reinforcement approach. And then I decided I wanted to start incorporating rescue into my work. We needed some additional horses for the dressage team. So I went ahead and took in 3 rescue horses from a local hoarding situation. And one of them was this huge gelding who turned out to be a very well-bred Hanoverian gelding. We thought he was like a draft cross of some sort because when he came to us, he was so emaciated. Like we couldn't really tell what was going on with him. And he was still young enough and stunted. And he came from a really rough situation. So as he ate more and the sedation that he had when I first acquired him wore off and all of that, he got stronger, more athletic. And also we started to learn why he had been passed around through so many homes. And so that's Bear, and Bear was very dangerous. And so he ended up tossing me in the dirt at one point. It wasn't even a huge conflict by any means, but he had so much trauma that he was just so easily triggered. And then he was so big and athletic that when he was triggered, it escalated into this very dangerous situation very quickly. And I was pretty seriously injured after that one, like in the hospital, can't feel my legs or move my toes or anything for a while. Really terrifying injury to have. And I realized that he was likely a behavioral euthanasia case, that he was so dangerous that there might not be anything we can do for him. And of course, before I jump to that extreme, I want to try and clicker train him. I hadn't done any clicker training with the horses yet. So I was like, I'd really like to try it. And this is a horse that doesn't have any other options. He has enough health issues that he's not going to be able to go live at a sanctuary, but he has such explosive behavior and is so big and strong and athletic that that level of reactivity is just not safe around people. So either we need to resolve this behavior or he might end up looking at euthanasia. So I went out there with a clicker and I clicked it and he bolted away from me in fear because that was a very scary noise to him. And it took a lot of trial and error. But the end result was within a year, I decided to move home and buy a farm so that I could do better care-wise and husbandry-wise. So I moved back to Missouri, bought my farm. And my goal when I moved here was to do 100% positive reinforcement. And I sort of figured I would do as much as I could until I can't anymore. Like I still had this idea in my head that eventually I would have to use the traditional methods, but I wanted to know how much could be positive reinforcement. And I'm pleased to report it's been, I think, about 5 years now since I've been back. I've worked with countless rescue horses and clients. I've traveled back and forth across the US numerous times teaching clinics. I have virtual students all over the world, and I have never had to default back to those traditional methods. Positive reinforcement can do anything and everything you need it to do. It's just a matter of figuring out the approach that's going to work best. And sometimes you might need to work with a professional so that you can get some tips and tricks of the trade to help you figure out what you're doing and what the best approach might be. But it's been a wonderful journey. I've grown a lot as a person and a lot like in my personal life and my own journey, as well as growing a lot professionally. I have a bunch of certifications. I have one in horse care and management, and then I have like an equine nutrition certification. I'm a certified hoof trimmer, like barefoot hoof trimming and hoof balance. I am IAABC certified, CHBC for animal behavior or horse behavior. And I've done Dr. Friedman's course. And I've done a lot of different education things involving horses. And then I've managed my facility. We have everything from high performance competition horses and competitive riders to casual trail riders to people that have their pet horses and don't do anything sport-wise or any riding or anything like that. And so I get a variety of horses through my clients, and then all of those horses have their own unique needs and their own environmental needs. And then I also get a variety of horses through the rescue, and we do specialize in the more serious and last chance cases, meaning that often we have to deal with some pretty intense needs from the horses, some pretty intense behavior problems, as well as just the horses' care needs and medical needs and whatnot. So over the years, I've learned a lot of tips and tricks for having a successful positive reinforcement practice and running a facility with a positive reinforcement approach. And I've also worked with a lot of clients with everything from their own backyard facilities to big professional operations to people navigating traditional boarding situations and all of that. So putting the horse first is something that probably involves a lot of layers. It's something that's probably easier said than done in a lot of situations. But if I had to summarize it, I think the best way that you can put the horse first is by having a trauma-informed approach to your behavior practice and really all of your horsemanship. So if you're familiar with trauma-informed psychology, you might already know some of these principles, but there are four main things we look for in a trauma-informed practice. And I've sort of specialized them to an equestrian setting or a horsemanship setting. So they're called the 4 R's. Number 1 is to realize the widespread impact of trauma. So in the equine industry, that means recognizing that the vast majority of the industry is traumatic for the horses and that it has harmful practices. Second R is recognizing trauma's impact on the specific equine. So that means recognizing that any horse you meet is more likely to have encountered harsh and violent training methods than they are to have never encountered them. That the vast majority of horses are going to encounter these harmful practices and have trauma from these practices. And we need to recognize that and respond constructively. And that's the third R, is to respond constructively in ways that facilitate healing. So recognizing when certain behaviors or certain things are related to trauma or a response to trauma, and then helping to facilitate healing rather than suppressing behaviors that you don't like. So allowing the horse to feel their feelings, if you will, and then helping them to overcome that. And then lastly, the 4th R is to actively avoid retraumatization. So that is to reject the harmful practices, no matter how widespread and common they may be, and instead choose to consistently educate yourself and improve your practices to ensure that what you're doing does not cause any further harm to the horse. And as a result, you should have an equine that feels safe during their interactions with you. You should have a relationship that is built on trust with the equine. The equine can expect pleasant interactions from the human and not be afraid that there are going to be aversive or harmful interactions. You should have an autonomous partnership that's based in consent, meaning that both parties have the opportunity to opt in and both parties have the opportunity to opt out at all times. And that means that the equine is going to be empowered by all of our interactions. We're going to choose things that build on the equine's strengths, and we're not going to ask them to do things that are difficult or harmful, and instead choose to build on things that help them become better and help empower them and build their confidence.
All right. Well, thank you for coming around back to that, because that was a completely fantastic answer, I must say.
Oh, well, thank you.
That's a fabulous answer. So yes, a lot of layers. Very important point. Easier said than done. Also, very important point. The trauma-informed work, my only concern about that is that it's a scary word to introduce to clients as a way of working with horses. A scare factor to it. As much as I like it, and it does describe a lot of things that I've picked up from horses. It fills out a lot of, as a young person coming up before the internet age, and before, it's funny when you said that at your school somebody had sent an email out. It's like, oh yes, when I was young, that was before email, so that would not have been able to happen. The trauma-informed thing really does flesh out, give a lot more detailed information as you're trying to pick out these behaviors.
I teach about the trauma-informed practices in my online course, and I teach a lot of this stuff, and so I have been over it a few times.
Gotcha. All right.
And cool. I do think what you were saying about the word trauma being kind of a loaded word, or one that brings a lot of baggage with it, I do completely agree that sometimes it can be really difficult to bring up that word, or even just the concept of harmful practices, but particularly with clients that are still doing those harmful practices. And I have found that in those situations, it is the most constructive to stay constructive. And by that, I mean to, instead of focusing on the things that somebody might be doing wrong, like if I have a client and I look at their care practices or their training practices, even if I am overwhelmed by just thinking, oh my God, please stop doing all of that. Even if I see all these things that are like, we need to improve this, this is bad. I never approach it by saying these things are wrong or these things are bad. I instead focus on, well, first of all, whatever the client is asking me to help them with, I'm going to try to stay within the scope of what I'm being asked to do, but also focusing on constructive recommendations. So never telling them, don't do this, but instead focusing on, this might be a good option, or this might be a good improvement. And then what I've found is over time, introducing these ideas of trauma-informed horsemanship, or moving away from harmful practices and starting to talk about the trauma and the harm that's so widespread throughout the industry, oftentimes it becomes easier to talk about the more you improve and the further you get away from those harmful practices. And that said, the reality of the industry is no matter where you stand in the industry, you've got some really harsh opinions about someone else in the industry, and that's sort of what I found when I was bouncing around between all these different disciplines. It's like the barrel racers say the hunter jumpers are bad, the hunter jumpers say the dressage riders are bad, the dressage riders say the reiners are bad, the reiners say the barrel racers are bad, and then we go in a circle. And so oftentimes I can talk about the trauma within the traditional industries. And even if a client might be doing practices that I would consider harmful or traumatic, they can usually still relate to what I'm saying and understand what I'm saying, even if in their head they're thinking about these more extreme harmful practices, right?
Yeah.
So usually that helps a lot. And then there are always going to be times where people just aren't quite ready to have that conversation and aren't quite ready for that discussion. And that is completely fine. And one of the things about trauma is that the brain and the body want to process trauma, and we want to heal from trauma. And so even just introducing these concepts to people, if they're not ready, at best, they might just politely decline and move on and do something different. At worst, they might have a pretty big defensive reaction to things. But even when that does happen, odds are what you've said and those ideas are still going to stick with them, because their mind and their body is going to want to heal and it's going to want to process those things. And so over time, when they feel safe and they feel like they're in a good place to do so, their brain is going to remind them of certain things that we've said or certain things we've addressed, and they'll start to come to their own conclusions and proceed on their own healing journey.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons that even though it is kind of a loaded subject, or can be, even the concept of trauma can, even just the word trauma can be kind of triggering for some people. And despite that, I do think it's the best word to describe the harmful practices and the effect it has on horses, but still respecting if somebody's not ready to have that conversation, that's completely okay. Everybody can be on their own journey at their own pace. And if you're not ready to talk about that, you don't have to. And if you are, we can talk about it. And that's totally up to each individual person,
Okay,
Hopefully
cool.
that all makes sense.
That makes sense. And thank you for that. So I will ask you about a couple of real world scenarios. So I'm a barn manager. Many of us do. I have horses getting injured or issues. So I'll give you a few examples. I really enjoy the good long process of clicker training specific cooperative care behaviors. But not all the clients are really interested. I'm a little tight on time. So what I wind up doing is a bit of a sandwich protocol. If maybe a horse gets a nice little gash in the middle of their head, and he's not particularly interested in me playing around with that. The protocol is very, very simple. I usually start with front loading them with a bunch of cookies to start. They're on the cross ties. They know something different is going on because I don't normally do this every day. Front load them with a bunch of cookies. And since this guy was, as soon as I put something in his face, he just sticks his nose straight in the air. Just raise my arm up with the saline bottle and then just immediately give him a cookie for that. Like, he's going to throw his head in the air, but don't worry about trying to get the horses to do much of anything. Take one tiny step towards what I'm trying to do. And then no matter what their reaction is, give them a cookie so that they know that this stimulus is always going to be followed. And within a short time, the horses will start coming towards me, or I keep my steps small enough that mostly what the horses are thinking is weird, strange thing, and then cookies. And then I generally just move forward with whatever it is I'm trying to do in whatever steps that they can take. That works for a lot of things. Some drugs have such a large volume, like Uniprim is a bunch of powder, and SMZs taste gross. So I haven't figured out how to get past those things that are, a lot of issues, the horses are just scared. Like, I'm really not going to hurt the horse when I clean a little wound. So they're more scared, but I'm not actually going to hurt them. If I stick a bunch of SMZs in their mouth, those things taste gross. I don't know if you've ever accidentally got some in your mouth, but they're gross.
I don't think so, but
okay, they are pretty bad. So I have not figured out how to, what I'm going to do with those. The horses really don't like it, and they're going to try to avoid it if they possibly can. But with the other things, as long as it's not something really painful or really gross, just reinforcing them before and after, whether they lower their head for me to clean the wound or not, just sandwichy. It's not really a training procedure. I'm mostly just reinforcing them positively while I'm doing this weird stuff in an effort to try to, persuade them like nothing terrible is going to happen. It's really just fine.
Yeah. So a lot of thoughts hearing all of that. I jotted down some notes while you were talking.
Go for it.
To address everything that
Cool.
I kind of heard.
Awesome.
So
Thank you.
first thing you were saying, and I heard you mention something along these lines earlier on as well, in regards to clicker training being a fun process, but taking a lot of time.
Yes.
And I beg to differ because now, and this might not have been the case when I first got started by any means, but now what I do with clicker training is incredibly efficient compared to all of the traditional methods that I was taught. And I was highly successful as a traditional trainer. So I had lots of successful methods and techniques, but nothing has been more efficient than clicker training. That said, there are a million different ways to get from A to B. I think it was Karen Pryor that said there are as many ways to teach behavior as there are trainers to think them up. And I love that because that's absolutely true. And I'll go ahead and share a quote from one of my clients in Arizona. So I was teaching a clinic I think it was in Phoenix, and I had somebody come over to me at lunch and she goes, "I love your training. I absolutely love what you do. It's so lazy." And I kind of I'm still smiling at her and I'm like, you said that like it was a compliment, but I don't think that was a compliment. Like, what is going on here? And I think she kind of got my facial expression and she was like, no. She's like, I just mean like a lot of these clicker trainers, it's like you have to do so many steps to get to the end goal. And what she was calling attention to was the fact that I am, and if that's how you want to phrase it, you could say I am a very lazy trainer. And that is that I value efficiency. I want to get from point A to point B as efficiently as possible in the vast majority of situations. So there are times, like I do think that a good horse person, the best horse person is going to enjoy the journey. And if you don't enjoy the process of training, you really have no business being a horse person because it's continuous training and continuous, like that's the vast majority of the time is going to be spent training and working with your horse on the behaviors. If you're only in it for the performance or that end goal, then there are a lot of other ways to fulfill whatever you're looking for. You can get a dirt bike, you can do a variety of other activities or sports to get whatever you're looking for. But if you're in it for the horses, then you're going to enjoy the time that's spent, the bulk of the time, which is spent training and doing those behavior processes. So there are plenty of times when I'm hanging out with my personal horses, like I don't mind taking my time and making a nice little loopy, windy path from A to B. But I also run a business and my clients certainly appreciate me being efficient with the time that I spend, since my time is their money. And I also work with rescues, and the more rescues I can get retrained and rehomed, the more I can take in, which means the more I can help. So I do very much value efficiency when it comes to training. And I don't want to spend 10 sessions over a week when I could do the same amount of progress in a single session. So as a result, I've developed a lot of different methods for making clicker training more efficient. So I'll go over a few of those with you, but just one more note as far as the timing goes.
I'm going to leave it there because Steph and I went on and talked for a while longer, but I want to say thank you so much again for coming on and joining me, Steph. It was wonderful to talk to you. You're obviously very educated and had a lot of experience, and I really got a tremendous amount out of our conversation, and I hope everyone who was able to listen to us got a lot out of it too. I will leave some details in the show notes because Steph talked about a lot of different things, and I'll see you all again later for part 2. Thanks for listening.